Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from United Church on the Green, located in New Haven, Connecticut. No matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are invited and welcome. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to learn more about our open and affirming ministry at United Church on the Green, please visit our website at unitednewhaven.org. Thank you.
So let us pray. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks with compassion in this world. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things pass away. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Those who have God find they lack nothing. God alone suffices. Amen. So my sermon today, the title is Naming God, and I want to talk to you about inclusion. But first I wanted to mention that within our LGBT community, we're experiencing quite a crisis because many transgender people are being murdered. This is a vulnerable population anyway, but right now the number is just increasing in a way that's making it an issue, and it's not being really looked at in the media at all. And even within our communities of faith, we're not really addressing it. So there's an event in November that most organizations have called Transgender Day of Remembrance. And if your church does not have an event that week, try to find something in your area so that you can stand as a community with this other community that is in trouble right now. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think in terms of talking about inclusion, this is one group that people of faith should really begin to reach out to. There's a lot of violence happening against that community. So that said, I had my whole sermon worked out, and then yesterday it turns out was Michael Jackson's birthday. And it's interesting, whenever I preach, Michael Jackson often ends up in my sermon, and I think, I really feel like he may be a prophet of our time. And it's weird to say that because he was so strange and so over the top, but I think if you think about it, prophets were kind of strange, the strange people of their time, so it makes a lot of sense. But he sings a song called Man in the Mirror. He sang a song called Man in the Mirror. And, you know, he's saying a lot of stuff, but what was sticking with me was starting with yourself. So I had this whole sermon worked out about how we could bring inclusion as a group of people, as a church community, but I really wanted to take Michael Jackson's word to heart that maybe inclusion starts with some sort of process within our own hearts. Can we figure out how we can love anybody just like what you said to the children, even if they look different from the way we do, or we, never seen them before, they might scare us a little bit. Could we love that person, and what does that have to do with creating a new space, for example, in a church? If that's our goal here, to be more inclusive, then maybe each of us starts with ourselves. So I'm going to start with Prophet Michael Jackson, with those words. So the word that I'm going to use is theology, and the way I see that word defined is that's the way we think about God, or the way we talk about God. So I'm inviting you to expand your theology to include other people, or to include everyone. And so in that process, we begin to be inclusive within our theology, within our church spaces. We can become inclusive in terms of our, who we welcome in and who feels welcome. So there are two camps, and one is Kyriarchy, and the other one is relational theology. Kyriarchy is Kyriachy, and it's a phrase that's coined by Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who's a feminist theologian. And what she's saying is that the idea of patriarchy has seeped into our religion. So this idea of male supremacy or male domination becomes not only a natural thing, but also a divinely sanctioned thing. So the idea that men are superior to women is something that is sanctioned by God. So that's what she's saying in terms of this term, Kyriarchy. She talks about dichotomies. So over here is male, over here is female, black, white, whatever your dichotomies are, a very strict definition, and then a hierarchy. So there are some groups that are on top of other groups. And the problem with that is that people are born free and people are equal. So in order to keep a hierarchy in place, there has to be a force, there has to be violence. And my thought is that the more we can recognize that structures that is kept in place are violent, the better we are. So if we don't recognize something as violent, if we don't recognize, for example, segregation as something that's violent or being kept in place with force, then we think it's just a natural thing. It's just natural that certain groups are doing better than other groups. It's just natural that some people live in a middle-class neighborhood that's safe, and other people live in a place that's not so safe. And we think of that as natural if we don't understand the history of this country and what's happening in terms of redlining and different things. So that's something to keep in mind. And also, within hierarchy, we cannot include women in terms that talk about God. We cannot include people who are not gender conforming in one way or the other. So these dichotomies keep us separate from relating to God. So the three words that are on the chopping block for today are master and king and Lord. And I'm not saying let those go as words, because as much as our churches like to be inclusive and we like to let go of words, once you start singing a hymn or you open a Bible, you're going to embrace these words. So it's just trying to think about things differently or expand them. With king and master and Lord, it is difficult to incorporate women into those words. It also represents that difference in power. So if you are a member of a historically oppressed group, you might not be able to relate to a God that's a master or a Lord. And then also, if you were abused in any way, you might not be able to relate to a God that's a master or a Lord or a king. So there's ways in which you can't really be included in terms of that language, but also you may not feel like you can relate to a God that's scary or up there. And then finally, so in terms of relational theology, so Thomas Ward is a man who talks about relational theology. His last name is O-O-R-D. And he says that God affects creatures in various ways. Instead of being aloof and detached, God is active and involved in relationships with others. God relates to us, and that makes an essential difference. Creatures affect God in various ways. While God's nature is unchanging, creatures influence the loving and living creator of the universe. We relate to God, and creation makes a difference to God. So what he's saying is that what we're supposed to do in religion is have a relationship with God. And it's not a relationship that goes one way in terms of praise, but it goes both ways. So that somehow we are important to God. The word that we use for fear, the Hebrew word, actually also can mean reverence or respect, or to be in awe or to honor. So the traditional way of looking at God is that God's up there on the cloud judging us, and we have to be afraid and fearful. But a new thought about it was, maybe God is awesome, and we're supposed to be down here praising and respecting and revering a God that's awesome. So these are just some things to think about when trying to break free of some words that keep us restricted in terms of relating to God, or keep all of us restricted. So I use relational theology to talk about some other ways to think about God. So bear with me as we go on a tour through the Bible. So at the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, we see God creating. So my first idea is that God is a creator. So God as creator in Genesis, it's interesting, there's two versions of Genesis, and the second one talks about ribs and the rib. And the man and the woman, and that whole thing bothers feminist theologians really a lot. The idea that a woman was created from man, so we like to focus on the first version. In the first version, there's a very clear us. There's a plural entity that creates something in the image, or in the image of us. And both male and female are created at the same time. So there's this room in there for everyone to be included within the image of God in just that first part of Genesis. So this idea of God as creator is one thing that I want to add in terms of how we can see God. The second thing is God who sees us. So in another part of Genesis, you have a young slave woman named Hagar who has an affliction, is in the wilderness, doesn't want to see her baby die. She lays her baby near the tree, she walks away, and then God finds her. And then she names God El Roy, which is, you see me. And so I see in that definition a God that is seeing us in our affliction, a God that cares about us, but more than that, a God that sees us in who we are, in all of our pain and whatever we're doing, in our imperfection, and accepts us as who we are. So the second idea is God as one who sees me. And it's significant to us that are feminist theologians that there's a woman who names God. So usually when you see God, God says, my name is something. But the only person in the Bible who ever names God is actually a woman. The third one is the idea of God as I am. So in Exodus, God appears to Moses and says, hey Moses, I want you to free people. And Moses basically says, who, me? And then, they have like this struggle with each other. But then later on, God says, Moses asked God, who should I say is calling? When something happens and they say, okay, who are you? Who is it that's telling you to come here and, tell my people, let my people go? And God says to Moses, my name is Yahweh, or I am. So the third idea is God as I am. And I think the I am God speaks to that creativity. There's a seed in each of us, something that we want to create. And that God is not only that seed, but also that motivation, that air, that breath that says, do this thing, you can do it, and that kind of energy. So in the God as I am, I feel like there's an inclusion of people who have a dream or, want to make change in the world because God is there in the I am. And then finally, the New Testament has a lot of great images that are about love. And so the third image is God, the fourth image, God is love, or God is the beloved. And in terms of what happens, I wanted to read John 3:16, which you're all very familiar with it, and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish but may have eternal life. And then 17 says, indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order the world may be saved through him. So in those simple verses, I feel like is the crux of everything. To me, those verses mean that anyone who wants this is for them. So the evidence of the inclusion is right there. So whomever believes is allowed to have this thing. And I think a lot as Christians, we sometimes forget that everyone phrase in that term. And then in the second one, the second part of it talks about not condemning the world. And then a lot of us spend a lot of time trying to condemn people who are not like us. And that that's not what it's about. That it's more about, here's this thing and it's for everyone, it's a gift. And so that's the important part of John 3:16 and 17. And then also at the end of Mark and at the end of Matthew, once Jesus is killed, there's an image of a curtain being torn from top to bottom. Now, in order to understand the importance of the curtain, you have to have read Exodus and the other testaments of the other parts of the Old Testament that talk about the Hebrew people walking around in the wilderness. They had camps, so they had to keep setting up their camp every time they moved. And there was a space that God lived in. And around in that space was a curtain. And I imagine it is red. I don't know why I imagine a red curtain. But imagine a red curtain. Behind the curtain is God, and on the other side are only the highest religious people. We're the only ones who could get anywhere close to where God was dwelling. Can you imagine an image of Jesus dying and a curtain that has God behind it being torn? So that, what does that mean? That means that we have access to God. We don't need anybody in between us, limiting, telling us who can have God and who can have God's love. We don't need people with titles. We don't have to have titles. We don't have to be, high priests. We can have access to God directly. And it is always there. And that's what the sacrifice of Jesus means, is that we have access to God directly. So in these, what I'm trying to give you is some ideas about other ways to look at God so that we can name God in a way that we can include other people. And the 4 examples that I found, I think, make it easy for us to include women, include people who are not gender conforming, include members of the LGBT community. It just makes it a lot easier when we have some other ways to think about God. And the reason why this is important We always want to believe that inclusion is important for the people we're including. It's important for people of color who want to come here, or it's important for a person with a wheelchair to have the ramp. It's important for there to be sign language so that people who can't hear will be able to have access. But it's also important for us because it makes us like God. And the point is to be like God. Not because we would have superpowers, we fly around and be invisible, or have lots of money and power, or any of that stuff that people think about, but it's more about having authority. You read Jesus' story as he's walking the earth, and people are asking him, who's this guy saying all this stuff about God with such authority, and who is he? How dare he says this? But what Jesus is saying to us is that we now have this authority. We can now heal others. We can now speak about the nature of God. We can now share God's love because we have this authority. And so that's what inclusion does. It makes us, it's like forgiveness. It's like having compassion and mercy for other people. It's just another way that we can be like God. Because my vision of God is that God is able and large enough to include everybody, and does and will. And so to be like God, we have to also be inclusive of everyone. So to recap, Michael Jackson says, start with the man in the mirror. So listen to him. And think about ways that you can be more loving towards people who are like you. Sometimes it's hard to love people who are like you. And that's hard, but it's also very hard to love people who are not like you. So that's something that you can begin with. And think about using the language of God that's also inclusive. And I gave some examples. There are some newer versions of the Bible that use these examples. Some are successful, some are not. But just begin to expand your idea about the way we call God, the way we use God, the way we think about God. And then try to create spaces before the people even arrive in your church who are different. That once they arrive, they'll be comfortable here. They'll come back a second time. They'll bring a friend back and that kind of thing. But I think it does start with us as individuals, just making that space in our heart and our mind about inclusion.